Hello. This little segment is on Ernesto Che Guevara. Or I guess Guevara. You can see how bad my language is. I apologize, by the way, for all my mispronunciations, whatever other cultural blindnesses you might perceive. I'm going to blame it on Ohio because that's where I was born and raised, and that is a super monoculture. I mean, I grew up on farms. I was like super rural Ohio, and I think one of the real deficits of that upbringing, there's probably good sides about it. I mean, I worked on farms and stuff, but we took a year of Spanish, 2 years of French. The people who taught me those things were not experts. We're certainly not native speakers. So I apologize for not being able to say Guevara right. So I probably will continue to say Guevara, and sorry. I'm gonna say some things about Guevara's history, and I'll try and make the point of the few things that I do say about that history, because Guevara's a fairly well-known person too. I'll try to use that biography in order to explain how it is that Guevara comes to have this profoundly, critical is probably too light a word, right? Hateful attitude towards the United States. In fact, he actually advocates, he says revolutionaries need to feel hate or else they won't be strong enough to do their jobs. And he says that the United States is the head of evil, the enemy, what is it? The enemy of humanity? That's the United States. So let me make some comments about this first. You might be wondering, coming as many of you do from a less radical perspective than the content in this class, you may be wondering, like, why all the critical attention to the U.S.? Why are we reading this text called 2, 3, Many Vietnams, in which Guevara recommends that guerrilla fighters all over the world should imitate the Viet Cong in attacking the United States? Like, why in the United States, from an American professor with American students, why should we engage in this criticism which is so profoundly anti-American? And I have some answers for that. For one thing, I think that James Baldwin is right, and that one key thing that needs to happen with us in order to change the situation of the lowest classes in the United States, to change the relationship between corporations and the population in the United States, in order to move towards more things like Standing Rock, in order to try to stop some of the profound and extensive is too small a word, pervasive interventions of American military power across the whole world. In order to actually change these things, we have to become aware of what we're actually involved in. So the reason, number one, to look at the history of United States imperialism, which is some of what we're looking at today, to look at how the United States appears to people outside the United States, how the United States appears to people who are interested in freedom and democracy. And by the way, realize, communism, which is Guevara's preferred denomination, it also makes a claim to realizing the freedom of human beings and to being fuller democracy than what we have. Of course, there are problems with that, but there's also tons of problems with our alleged democracy. It's important to recognize how the United States appears, how the United States is, from perspectives other than ours. And remember that ours are particularly saturated with an ideology that prevents us from understanding what we have been, where we come from, what we are now involved in. And remember, there's that question about we too, right? Who's we? Is we, when I said we, I meant us and the government, but maybe the government and corporations, which I believe are always working in collaboration with one another, maybe they are an external entity. And this is where Guevara and Fanon and Baldwin and Carmichael and probably Davis ended up, at least in the 1960s, thinking that the lowest classes and the critical elements of American society need to form coalitions with the oppressed of the rest of the earth, who are being in large part oppressed by the United States. Of course, we're not the only oppressor. And, if you want, you can go ahead and say, well, Russia is a similar entity. But I want to talk about that too. It's very easy to criticize Russia. It's very easy to criticize China. And we can look at those places, and of course we only get very slanted and very selective portrayals of these places through the media, right? It's easy to say, okay, Vladimir Putin's a crazy dude riding around with his shirt off. He's a totalitarian dictator. Everybody in Russia is in a terrible situation. Gay people are having a hard time of it. Pussy Riot keeps going into jail and then coming out. Protest is disallowed. That's easy. It's easy because it doesn't implicate us, because I don't have to feel bad. In fact, the worse Russia looks, the better I feel about America. If I look over at China and I say, hey, in China there's this sort of totalitarian regime which runs elections, but all the people on the ballot are from the same party, and it's pretty clear who you're supposed to vote for, and there are consequences sometimes if you don't, and people are living many places without electricity. They're living in these really horrible sort of dormitory situations where they are basically imprisoned as they work in factories. It's easy to criticize China, and there are grounds to criticize China. Of course, when we criticize China, we are lacking plenty of other information. The whole rich, massive tapestry of this multicultural country is absent from our view because it's not portrayed for us. Nevertheless, it's easy and it's even justifiable to criticize China. Not only is it justifiable, it makes me feel better. The more China sucks, the more glad I am to be an American. And this is the way that we're supposed to proceed. What about North Korea? What about Iran? What about, but of course we're not supposed to criticize Saudi Arabia because they're an ally, even though they're a dictatorial regime. We're not supposed to criticize Turkey, even though Turkey is becoming sort of radical Islamist state, and it's relatively totalitarian, and Erdogan has been engaged in a purge of that country, of professors, etc. Tens of thousands of people have been imprisoned under Erdogan. We're not supposed to criticize Turkey because they're a NATO ally and a key launching pad for attacks on Iraq and Syria that we're engaged in. But it's easy to criticize these other places, and the more we do it, the better we feel about ourselves. I think this is the wrong way to go about things. It's the wrong way to go about things, for one, because the picture that we have of these other places is willfully ignorant, willfully selective. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is that I can't do anything about Russia. I don't live in Russia. I'm not going to affect Vladimir Putin or the operations of whatever is the name of the contemporary KGB, or Russia's special forces operations in Chechnya or in Syria. I can't do anything about that stuff. I'm just a little dude hanging out in my backyard, making next to no money to talk to a fucking camera. How am I going to affect Russia? How am I going to affect China? I can't. And also, think about like Thoreau and Adolf Eichmann and stuff. I'm sure that the anarchist view, of course, is that all governments are up to no damn good. You build structures of hierarchy, and they will inevitably, and in every case, express themselves eventually with atrocities. They will dominate. That's the nature of, if you build a dominating relation, it'll result in domination. In Russia and in China, I'm not involved in their particular evils. Maybe very, very distantly, insofar as I bought this hat from Amazon and it was made in China. But for the most part, I'm not involved in those particular evils. But I am involved in this one. And I may not be able to change what the American government does, how special forces operate, but it might be that I have a responsibility to do so. It might be that some of you in this class are on your way to becoming officers and soldiers who are going to go and do the dying and the killing on behalf of, I would say, on behalf of the corporations that are served by the United States military. These things affect us much more greatly. So, the conservative sort of view on professors like me is that we're anti-American assholes, traitors, a variety of traitors. And I would say in response to that, well, maybe you got to think about different varieties of patriotism, right? When patriotism means blind obedience to a flag and everything that your leaders do, whether those leaders are in government or in the corporate world, I have no use for that patriotism at all. And in this respect, I'm totally anti-American. I'm not into nation states. I'm not into authority. I'm certainly not into imperialism, and I'm not into the armed defense of capitalism, private property, and the 1% or the 1% of the 1%. I'm not down for any of that. And so not being down for that, if that makes me anti-American, fine, fine. And I would encourage you to be anti-American in this way too. But I don't believe that this is the only variety of, patriotism and loyalty. If we nurture what I think is a much more real, much more concrete, much less abstract loyalty to the people we live around, to our co-workers, to our co-classmates, to our family members, to the people that we see here in our city, that variety of patriotism calls for radically different things. If you see that the economic conditions of all kinds of people are horrific, that they are stuck in situations from which they cannot get out, and this is all getting worse, then this calls upon people in an ethical way to do something. And so that's what I do in teaching this sort of stuff. That's why I think it's important to read Che Guevara, etc. That's why I think that we ought to listen to James Baldwin when he says, white people, mainstream people, people who are going to work for corporations, y'all who are psyched to live in suburbs and get yourself a jet ski and a big truck and have success, y'all need to really look at the system that you're a part of. Y'all need to look at the history you're really a part of. And y'all need to stop calling riots, call them rebellions. Rather, stop calling rebellions riots, and so on. So the point of becoming critical about our own situation, the reason that there's a special place reserved for the criticism of our own country here, is not out of some kind of traitor instinct. It's because this is the only place that we can impact, and this is the only place where we are already participating, whether we like it or not. This is the reason to look at these profoundly critical evaluations of the United States. And that's what we get with Che Guevara's 2-3 many Vietnams. Okay, so let me tell you about him. I mean, you know him from the t-shirts, right? Handsome guy, beret, kind of like lamb chop guys on his face. He's a notorious revolutionary, right? And everybody knows he took part in the Cuban Revolution. I'll fill that out a little bit. So he's Argentine. He's from this place called Rosario. And in about the year that he died, there was actually some really interesting kind of critical art that came out of Rosario, a group called the Rosario Group, which was critical of the Argentinian government at that point, which was supported by the CIA and so on. The CIA makes consistent appearances through the history of Che Guevara. So he trained as a doctor, and shortly after finishing his training, he decided to travel around, and he went to Mexico and he went to Guatemala. And while there, he got, maybe he was politicized before, but he got way more political. He got involved with political groups. And he started meeting, so at this same time, this is 1953, 1954. At the same time, Fidel Castro had launched his first attempt to start a revolution in Cuba. Now, the situation in Cuba was that a guy named Batiste was in charge. And this guy was supported by the United States. This guy, and this is always the case, you can follow this as far back as you want. Go back to Mexico in 1910. Why was there a revolution against Porfirio Diaz? We used to do the Mexican Revolution in this class, and we're not for the sake of space, but why did that revolution in 1910 take place? It took place because Diaz, over the course of many decades of rule, had consistently ripped Mexico's territory away from Mexican people and handed it over to international capital, especially the United States. So the United States owned tremendous resources in Mexico, including a tremendous amount of land, when that revolution took place. So did Germany, but mainly the United States. Very successful dictator types and countries across the globe are maintained in their success through their affiliation with the United States military, and historically especially the CIA. And what keeps them in good standing is that they are required to make their country free, not in terms of the circulation of people, So under Diaz and under Batiste, people were locked to the land. And there were bands of soldiers who were basically gangsters and thugs serving the administration who would beat the shit out of, imprison, or kill anybody who opposed their administration. So not freedom for people, but freedom for trade. There's got to be an openness to the world capitalist market, and more specifically, there's got to be a willingness to open resources and labor supplies and markets, all these things, to multinational corporations. And that was the situation with Batiste. That's why Castro chose that target. That's why he wanted to liberate Cuba. And so when he goes first, he fails. He goes with 50 people to try and start a guerrilla uprising, and they're nearly all executed. Only a few of them escape, including Castro. So they escape back to Mexico, and then or maybe they end up in Guatemala. And this same time, Guevara has traveled to Guatemala. Now in Guatemala, there is a democratically elected, socialist-oriented leader. He was in power in 1953, but he was already being attacked. And what happened? Mercenary forces were hired, trained, armed, funded by the CIA. Because systematically, the CIA, operating in the interests of American capital, it opposes any kind of socialist government, because a socialist government is going to keep its resources closed to international capital. It's not going to hand over the land. It's not going to hand over the oil supplies. It's not going to hand over the mineral supplies. It's not going to allow all of the infrastructure for processing of these raw materials, all the manufacturing, etc., to be taken control of by Exxon and Chevron. It's not going to let that happen. Or it's going to try and reverse those systems of ownership, those situations of ownership, if they're already in place. This is unacceptable from the perspective of the U.S. So, I mean, you should be aware that, when we talk about supporting freedom and democracy globally, that's a damn lie. So what happens? So Che meets, and Che, I guess, is Argentinian idiom for just saying hi, what's up? So because he was Argentinian and he sounded funny to like other Spanish speakers from Central America, they called him Che. So Che, in the meantime, has met Castro, and he decides he joins up to go back to Cuba. But at the same time, the situation in Guatemala is getting much worse. And these mercenaries, backed by the CIA, are toppling the government there. So Che gets involved in fighting against those proxy forces guided by the CIA. So for his whole life, for his whole military life, which extends, 15 years or so, maybe 18 years, he's fighting the CIA the whole time. He's all over the world. But in reality, he's always fighting the CIA because the CIA is all over the world. And what is it doing all over the world? It's attempting to free territory for free trade. Does this mean that it wants to free people? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The movement of people, the life conditions of people, the capacity of people to organize, the rights of people to the things that are necessary to live, reference Robespierre, all these things are driven down by the CIA advanced agenda of northern capital. So he and Castro get imprisoned for a period of time, but then they go back to Cuba and they launch this famous revolution, which ultimately is successful. And they establish a socialist, communist government. And they also establish, different from the recommendation of Frantz Fanon, they establish a sort of alliance with the Soviet Union, which makes it possible for them to continue to exist in terms of the delivery of goods, the capacity to export goods. There's a really good documentary recently placed on Netflix about Cuba. I think it's called like Cuba and the Cameraman, or Castro and the Cameraman, something like that, which shows kind of what Cuba was like, and also talks a bit about what happens when the Soviet Union falls, and how the loss of imports and exports super cripples Cuba. Anyway, so Guevara takes part in this revolution. He's second in command to Castro, to Fidel Castro, becomes a hero. You know, he's made a Cuban citizen. He's made a Cuban diplomat. He travels the world, you know, speaking on behalf of Cuba. And then he decides that he wants to continue the revolution. This is in a way, this is a continuation of sort of the Trotsky branch of Marxism, which this is one of the points on which Trotsky and Stalin had fallen out, was that Stalin decided that the communist revolution could stay in the Soviet Union. You know, that it wasn't necessary to export the revolution globally if you could make a country like the Soviet Union strong enough that it could withstand adversaries on the outside. The Trotsky view had been, he wrote a famous essay called, what is it, The Permanent Revolution, something like that. And Trotsky's view was that, no, and I think this is truer to Marx's view, if you have a local communist revolution which nationalizes things, which pushes capital out, which attempts to put the workers in charge of their own production and so on, but that revolution does not expand, international global capitalism will eventually crush that communist revolution. So the failure of the Soviet Union does not disprove Marx. In fact, it shows that in certain ways he was right. So Trotsky had the idea that the revolution had to be exported. It had to be grown all over the world, or else it's going to get destroyed locally. It has to get bigger. And this is, roughly speaking, the view to which Guevara subscribed. So putting his body and his money where his mouth was, he traveled first to Congo and then to Bolivia. And the idea in each of these places was to make a guerrilla revolution there. He was doing what he recommended in 2-3 Many Vietnams, which was he wanted to expand guerrilla resistance to United States imperialism globally. So the United States, of course, was supporting Batiste. When the Cuban Revolution succeeds, we go through a series of moves where the United States tries to destroy Cuba. In the early 60s, maybe 1961, 62, Castro and the Cubans, they nationalize oil refineries and then land. They take it away from companies like Exxon. The United States cannot conscience this. It pulls out its diplomats, it breaks diplomatic relations, it imposes an economic embargo which stays in place until pretty much the present, and eventually it launches a couple of attacks. It keeps trying to assassinate Castro, and then it famously invades at the Bay of Pigs and is pushed back by the Cubans. They mess it up. So the United States is trying to destroy Cuba under the heading that this is the Cold War and here's communism and an ally of the Soviet Union in our backyard. But I think more consistently, in the same way that it had been destroying and toppling any regime which was resistant to the intrusion, especially of American capital, especially from World War II forward. So it had been in Korea, it's in Guatemala, it's in Cuba, and it's even in Congo. So when Che goes to Congo, he's trying to organize guerrilla forces, and they're ultimately defeated, and they're defeated because the CIA is in Congo and figures out how to stage a coup to push out a recent revolutionary government. Che goes to Bolivia. U.S. Special Forces are in Bolivia training counterinsurgency troops, and these are the troops that ultimately destroy Che Guevara, and he dies. So throughout his entire life, he's pursued by what he calls American imperialism. And when he talks about American imperialism, he's not just being hateful, he's being descriptive. So I think the important thing to recognize is that, you know, things have not changed. In fact, they've gotten worse, because there used to be, well, at least the aggression of the United States has gotten worse, because there used to be a second power. You know, the power of Russia counterbalanced the power of the United States globally, which is not to say that the influence of Russia was any more benign. But the U.S. has a military presence, and a military presence which is uniformly, I believe, serving the interests of global corporations, and at this point, not even particularly American ones, because, well, when we read Marcos in a little bit, Subcomandante Marcos of the Zapatistas, you'll get, I think, a pretty lucid description of what happens in our contemporary phase, which is that corporations have become more powerful than nation states at this point, and nation states basically do the bidding of corporations, whether they are American or not. And the American military, the American militaries, and the American intelligence apparatus globally is the most prominent. It's, of course, ours is the most, ours. The United States military is the most powerful one in the world. And what is it doing? I find this interesting. I've had many students who were, ROTC or National Guard or had been, and a lot of people who had been military. There's one guy in particular who really sticks in my memory. His name's Ruben. Had done 3 or 4 tours, including a couple of Purple Hearts in Iraq. And what I find is that the longer a particular service person has served, the less ideological their evaluation of their service becomes. I had another guy who had been a Marine lieutenant in Afghanistan, and he went to Afghanistan, he thought, in order to defend women. And then he came out with a realization like, oh, the American presence in Afghanistan had very little to do with that, if any. Like, it used that idea. And of course, you can actually find specific pieces of propaganda that were distributed in the U.S. about this sort of stuff. It used the idea of, defenseless women, which is like a favorite American myth, in order to recruit soldiers and in order to whitewash its war. But once this guy had been involved in that war for a couple of years, he thought that this had nothing to do with it. And Ruben's comment was, there's no justice, there's no freedom. What does the United States do? His answer was, the United States military basically protects shipping lanes. This is how he saw it. That it allows for continued trade to happen, and trade along the lines that are prescribed by and favorable to multinational corporations. That was his view after 3 or 4 tours. I think that's what the United States really does globally. But you should recognize that our military is everywhere over the globe. The United States has, I think, 800 to 1,000 acknowledged military bases across the globe. Can you imagine if North Korea had a single military base in, like, I don't know, Panama? It would be destroyed immediately. It would be an international scandal. We would not stand for it. And yet the United States has 800 to 1,000 acknowledged bases. And of course, all the CIA operations, the Special Forces operations, they prefer to use facilities which are leased under corporate names, under shell companies. So the real number of bases, the real number of operations that the United States military is carrying out globally is unknown. But you can check out, there's a link to a Democracy Now! Interview with a guy named Nick Turse, talking about the 4 soldiers who were recently, American Special Forces soldiers, who were recently killed in Niger. And everybody's like, whoa, what were they even doing there? Well, you can go read a book that Nick Turse wrote 2 years ago called Tomorrow's Battlefield, in which he demonstrates that for the year or 2 leading up to the publication of that book, American Special Forces had been operating in every single country in Africa. It's probably true that the United States has special forces and intelligence operatives in every single country on the face of the globe. So when somebody like Guevara talks about imperialism, you should realize he's not just using nasty language. When he talks about Yankee imperialism, when he says that the United States is the enemy of humankind, he means it because the United States actually goes into country after country after country. And he saw it. He saw it in Guatemala. He saw it in Cuba. He saw it in Congo. He saw it in Bolivia. He saw it in the rest of Africa where he traveled. The United States goes in. Nowadays we do it with Special Forces. Special Forces is like the growth center of the American military. We put Special Forces in place, and they often technically play advisory roles or training roles. But what they're really doing, we're arming, and then we're training, and then we're funding, we're constructing proxy armies to do the interest of allegedly the United States interest, right? But the United States interest doesn't mean my interest or your interest. It means the interests of people like Donald Trump, maybe, and big companies like Exxon. I mean, now we have this weird situation where Rex Tillerson, at least for the time being, head of Exxon, is in charge of American diplomacy. And he actually looks like liberal compared to Trump. How fucked up is that? But there's something transparent about that. Exxon is like guiding American foreign policy. This has been the case indefinitely, at least since World War II. So we are all over the globe. And it's not just that like our uniformed forces, the ones that we can recognize, are attacking people, and they are. And talk to any soldier who lived through Afghanistan or Iraq. I talked to one, I had a friend who did a documentary, which is pretty good, called Above and Below. And one of the characters who's in that documentary was a veteran of the Iraq War, and she talked about the necessity of dehumanizing the enemy, because there's dead bodies everywhere. And in order not to be overwhelmed by this tragedy, by the horror, you had to tell yourself that these aren't people. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces kill all kinds of people. They don't know if they're the enemy or not. They drop bombs places. They don't know who's there. We've been doing the same thing since Korea. We leveled Korea. I mean, you want to think about the situation in North Korea today and how evil and crazy this dictator is. You should put that in some perspective. You should realize, where does that regime come from? That regime comes from the Korean War, in which we literally flattened the entirety of North Korean territory, dropping more bombs on Korea than had been dropped in the entirety of World War II. So we've been doing this all over the place, but it's not just our uniformed forces. It's not just our drones, which at least could be like kind of traced back to the US. It's that we've got shadow operations in most of the countries on the face of the globe, except where we're pushed off by, other zones of influence, the zone of influence by the Russians or the Chinese, and there we infiltrate more covertly. And you can see this kind of like headbutting over influence, for example, in Ukraine or in Syria. And in Ukraine, of course, we're told that Russian separatists or Russian-oriented separatists are really backed by the Russian military. I'm sure that's true. But what is always occluded, what's always hidden in that story, is how the legitimate government in Ukraine got put in place, and that was by a CIA, probably CIA, United States-backed coup. I think it was Blackwater-backed, actually. Blackwater's a mercenary company. Doesn't have that name anymore. It was Blackwater, and then it was Greystone, and then it was XE, and now I think it's Academy. And it's run by this dude named Eric Prince, who happens to be the brother of Betsy DeVos, the education secretary. So I believe that mercenaries, American hired mercenaries, were in Ukraine. But like, this is a fairly well established thing, that there was a coup. It was American backed, and the majority of the personnel who were put into power by that coup had neo-Nazi histories. So first the US pushes on Ukraine, and this is a violation of previous agreements. The US agreed at the end of the 1980s not to push NATO eastward, but it has been doing that. It's been moving missile batteries into Estonia and Latvia, into the Baltic states, and it's moving into Ukraine. And so you can see the Russian response, especially to hold Crimea, to hold it's this little peninsula that goes into the Black Sea where the Russians have like a key naval port. They want to hold that because that's their military defense position. That's what guarantees their access to the Black Sea, and by means of the Black Sea, their access to the Mediterranean. Now, not to say that the Russians aren't every bit as like imperialistic and capitalist as the US, but just to understand that Ukraine is not just an instance of like Russian aggression. It's a place where Russian and United States capitalist aggression are pushing on one another, and they're both capitalist nations playing the same game with all kinds of overlap. Rex Tillerson being one of them, Donald Trump being another. Syria is another such situation where the traditional balance of power is now like in turbulence because Assad had been backed by the Russians for a long period of time. Now the United States starts funding, arming, training the Free Syrian Army, trying to extend the Arab Spring in 2012, 2013 by fomenting civil war in Syria. This is what we do all over the place. Now we can say that Assad is like a nasty bastard. Clearly he is. I mean, I would think state apparatuses are nasty bastards, if you ask me. But this doesn't change the fact that the United States is also pushing to open territories which had traditionally been socialist in one respect or another. State socialist, let's call it, which is not that great from an anarchist perspective, but at least it's different than total free market neoliberal capitalism. The United States, in the interests of multinational capital, is always trying to open up territories, markets, labor supplies, and raw materials that had been kept secluded in one way or another by national populations, national governments. This is what we're doing all over the place. Of course, this is during Vietnam, right? So it's really clear that the United States has very little respect for foreign life, Asian life, Vietnamese life. Millions of people were killing in Vietnam and Cambodia, carpet bombing, napalming, children. Why? And in that case, well, it depends on who you read. Certain American generals will say, and I don't remember, maybe this is in the Guevara, there are raw materials in Vietnam that the United States wanted, tin in particular. But also, as Jean-Paul Sartre writes about Vietnam this way, he's like, Vietnam is just one great big precautionary massacre that says, hey, if you fuck with the US, this is what's going to happen to you, because we don't give a shit about you. And generally, I think the understanding about Vietnam was like the struggle over Vietnam was a struggle in order to quarantine China. So it's a geopolitical maneuvering where the United States is using its power wherever and however it can to facilitate the intrusion of capital and thus the exploitation of people, and also the degradation of the environment, the reduction of education, the reduction of guarantees for life, for clean water, for good food, for housing, all these things which a socialist regime at least claims to satisfy. Of course, this is not to say that socialist regimes can't become corrupt. Clearly they do. But the US is involved, I would say, in a global imperialism. And that's what Guevara is talking about. Okay, so what does he recommend? What does Guevara recommend? He recommends that revolutionaries, first of all, he's like Fanon. He's a little bit after Fanon's death, but he is taking part in the same kind of congresses that Fanon was involved in, particularly in Africa. They're both interested in, so we have the colonial period with French and British influence, which sort of gives way in World War II to the dominance of the United States. An easy place to see that is in the Middle East, where, the Middle East, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, those were zones of British influence. Well, not Lebanon, but Iraq and what becomes Israel and Jordan. These were zones of British influence, but they were so beaten back. Their colonial empire took such a great amount of damage in World War II that they were sort of forced out. But what happens is they just handed over the administration of the Middle East to the United States. And we back up the establishment in 1948 of Israel in the Middle East as a sort of permanent garrison, a foothold for Western values, freedom and democracy, but really for capitalist exploitation and for a foothold for pushing against a whole wave of socialization that had taken place in the 1950s out of decolonization. So you had Arab nationalism in Egypt and in Syria and in Iraq, the whole Ba'ath Party. This is a major movement, and the United States military, as armed wing of multinational capital, needed to establish a foothold to push against all of these regimes. And it's been engaged in a kind of like game of pressure and sort of trade-offs ever since then. Part of these trade-offs involve, alliance with the Saudi regime, for example. And the Saudis, as a part of OPEC, have made agreements with the United States, and this is why we're funding them and why we're giving them money. But this backfires in all kinds of ways too. So the Saudis, a lot of the Saudis ended up funding Al-Qaeda. So I would like you to at least take it seriously that there might be such a thing as American imperialism. So what does Guevara want? He, like Fanon, wants to form a coalition of all these different places which are impacted by capitalist and American aggression. They're also, of course, inundated with American culture. And so there's this ideological component to the domination of the world. We want to, the way that they started talking about it in Vietnam, in the Vietnam period, was winning hearts and minds. So that's part of like the mission of PSYOPs in the military, but it's also part of the general policy of American style capitalism. We are now saturating the globe in American culture, and here we live in one of the centers for the production of cultural material. So this stuff impacts you, right? Like this tells you something about the world where you live. Anyway, so form a coalition of different oppositional groups and follow the model of Vietnam. So this means, Guevara is like a full-on militant revolutionary. He's like, Vietnam shows the capacity of a guerrilla movement to counter even a military power as great as that of the United States. Fanon had derived this lesson in the first anti-colonial success of the Vietnamese people when they pushed out the French. And there was this particular battle which was clearly the turning point in that struggle, which is Dien Bien Phu, the point at which Vietnamese nationalist forces involved in an anti-colonial struggle, trying to push the French out of Vietnam, succeeded. And this showed that a guerrilla movement, starting with next to no armaments, which was clearly outgunned by its colonial occupier, if it engaged in careful and devoted guerrilla warfare, could nonetheless drive out its more heavily armed occupier. And Fanon had said, well, man, once the whole world saw that, everybody who was colonized started getting ideas. He says, we all wanted our own Dien Bien Phu, and it's just a question of time before we get it. This is Guevara's attitude too, that Vietnam, and then again, the resilience of Viet Cong troops versus the United States military, who just bombed the hell out of the entire territory and DDT'd the territory and bombed women and children, and then neighboring Cambodia, destroyed Cambodia to such an extent, produced such a massive supply of orphans in that country that it facilitated the growth of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. Even though such massive firepower is deployed in Vietnam, the Vietnamese guerrilla organization is able to succeed because of its basic adoption of basic guerrilla principles. You know, you don't attack the enemy head on. You ambush them from the sides. You harass them at all times. You try to attack their supply lines. You try and attack their ammo dumps. You attack them where they're weak and you run away the rest of the time. But also, you form very deep and careful and very ethical relationships with the general population. So, like, you know, Mao Zedong also wrote about guerrilla warfare in China. And when the Black Panthers pick up a bunch of their rules for how Black Panthers members ought to operate, they take them direct from Mao. And those rules are like, you know, you should never take so much as like a needle or a spool of thread from a member of the general populace. You have to treat everybody, and for the Panthers, you know, so this means within the neighborhoods, you got to treat everybody in the community with the utmost respect. Hamas has operated the same way in Palestine, you know, the same way that the Black Panthers provided free breakfasts and free clothing and free food and free education to people in certain communities, Oakland and Detroit and all over the country. This is what Hamas has done in Palestine. It treats the population as respectfully as possible, and by this means it develops a stronger relationship of trust with the population than the population has with its occupying authority. In this case, the Oakland Police Department, or you know, the Israeli soldiers, or in Vietnam the French, and then the Americans. And that's the kind of relationship. So then the population will pass information, it will harbor arms, it will hide people. When there is a true relationship of trust between a guerrilla movement, which is perceived as really advancing the interests of the general population, you know, engaging in population defense, it's really, really hard for an occupying force to win the population back to itself. This is what they're trying to do all the time. They were trying to do it in Vietnam, trying to win hearts and minds, and you can see it now. You watch like any number of documentaries about Afghanistan, even, you know, like super pro-American ones, and you'll see these Marine lieutenants, you know, walking into a little village, and they're sitting down with the elders, and they're trying to convince them that we're here to help you. See, the problem is, and I'm sure that a lot of those lieutenants, like, you know, they're trying to do their job well, and they do believe, and a lot of those soldiers do believe that they're there to help them. But the thing is that the village elders, they know it's false. Even if the young American soldiers, you know, really think like, oh man, your country's all fucked up. You've been, like, you know, dominated by the Taliban. We're here to liberate you and bring freedom and democracy. Those young 20-year-old kids don't actually understand history, don't actually understand geopolitics, don't actually know whose agenda and what overall process they themselves are a part of. They don't know. But the village elders do. They understand more broadly, you know, what is the nature of the American presence in Afghanistan? What was the nature of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan? What is the nature of the Taliban's behavior in Afghanistan? And this is not to say that they're big fans of the Taliban either. They are looking for groups to actually do the will of the general population, and this, among other things, means pushing foreign occupation out. When that formula is satisfied, a guerrilla army is produced which, though it be outgunned, though it be outmanned, though it be outmoneyed, has a really good chance, if it perseveres, and this is part of guerrilla warfare. You know, they have to have, Guevara says, they have to have a strong hatred, but they also have to have a strong love. You know, they're passionately involved. They're fighting on their own territory. They're fighting for their own lives. They're fighting for their own families. This is something different than what's going on for the American soldiers. So Guevara says, okay, the American soldiers trained really well. They've got really good equipment. They've got great communications apparatus. They're fairly disciplined. You know, they're good. It's a good army. It's an impressive army. But what they don't have is a real reason to be doing what they're doing. And the longer that American forces stay in a place like Vietnam or a place like Afghanistan, the more their morale drops, because they start to see these people don't want us here. We're told that we're here to help them, but they don't want us to help them. And, you know, like the kind of uninformed American soldier perspective is like, well, fuck them. We're trying to help them, and they don't even want our help. How ungrateful. The informed, even soldier perspective, like the soldiers I was talking about before, who have spent a long time in situations of combat, etc., is like, oh, wait, that's just something that the brass tells us to say. That's something that we say in the media, but we're not here to help anybody. And so, I mean, I think the real operative agenda of groups of American soldiers becomes to survive and to protect your buddies. I think there's such a grand tragedy in the fact that this instinct to form tight relationships, to have absolute trust between people, to put your lives in other people's hands, to be able to operate as a group in solidarity, to care so deeply about other people that you'll jump on a grenade for them. I mean, these are all like awesome aspects of human character, right? I think it is such a tragedy that those capacities of humans are co-opted by these large-scale structures, which are basically serving the interests of like a very few people, or even of an anonymous system of the accumulation of capital at particular places. That is such a grand tragedy. And wouldn't it be nice if all these young men and now young women, with this courage, with this willingness to face death, etc., if they could do that on an informed basis? Because, you know, somebody like Guevara or Fanon or Baldwin or Carmichael, they're like, you know, if that really were to happen, they would become revolutionaries in their own country and not occupiers somewhere else. So Guevara's recommendation is 2, 3, many Vietnams. He wants to nurture this kind of resistance globally. And he even goes so far as to say, well, I'll give you like 2 more things and then I'll be done. One, he says, okay, what you're trying to do in opposing American imperialism is you want to undermine the foundation of that imperialism. And the foundation is the vast, large, exploited population, which has been subsumed into a global capitalist machinery for labor and wealth generation in the North. You want to erode that foundation, and that means you want to go for that population and you want to turn that population. You want to infiltrate that population. Now, from the American perspective, this is nothing but like, you know, communist takeovers, right? From the Marxist perspective, or from Guevara's perspective, no, it's about liberating these people from the exploitation of capital. And it may well be the case that many times when this alleged liberation happens, what really is happening is that local groups are just becoming the pawn of another force, like say the Soviet Union. That's happening too. But the basic idea is you want to erode that base that allows international capitalism with the armed guard of American imperialism to continue extracting value wherever it is. If you significantly infiltrate the population and you get a guerrilla movement going within it, it becomes less and less possible to extract resources, extract labor, generate value, access markets, all that stuff, which is like the real process that the American military is facilitating. You start to gum that up, and the strength of that overall system is being diminished. But you have to do this all over the place. And then lastly, I mean, in case he doesn't sound extreme enough, lastly, he says, we got to be prepared for total war. And this, you could accuse him of consciencing terrorism here. Probably that's what he's doing. Of course, you know, he would have you know that we are engaged in the greatest terrorism of all, which I think is true. But what he recognizes is that the moment that you engage in any kind of guerrilla opposition, any kind of popular opposition, any kind of armed opposition, and like Fanon, he thinks that's the only thing that's real. You know, you can try and outmoral people, but it's not going to achieve anything. The moment you start really resisting Northern capital and the American military apparatus, they're going to fuck you up. And they're not just going to go for you, they're going to go for your families too. This is what happens in Palestine, for example. Palestinian people, some of them, organize themselves to fight against the Israeli occupation. And anytime anybody's caught, they're tortured, generally. They're imprisoned. A lot of people who didn't really have any involvement are imprisoned for long periods of time. There's this like general counterinsurgency strategy of sweeping up the general population and just sort of like sifting through them. But there's also group punishment. So if a Palestinian is caught in an act of rebellion, the Israelis will destroy their whole home. So like this affects the entire family. Sometimes they'll destroy the whole family. And you know, like the whole practice of aerial assassination, which now is like so favored by the United States, like our whole drone program, that's kind of like the CIA's like, you know, most up and coming program, because otherwise it's been backed off by the NSA and the DIA under Rumsfeld and Condoleezza Rice and all that. Those aerial assassinations, so, you know, take like a gunship, helicopter, or then a little bit later you take a drone and you send a missile. And of course, actually this stuff is even more elaborate than this. Like the way the drone shit works is that they're actually using systems of dozens and sometimes hundreds of drones to track people for months in order to develop, you know, an algorithmic understanding of their regular paths in order to figure out like what's the best place to hit them. And then they hit them, and whoever's in the car dies. And whoever's in the building dies. And sometimes that includes the target, and sometimes it doesn't. But it almost always includes somebody else. So if you want to like really deal with the nature of American and capitalist imperialism, you got to realize that from the very beginning, it's a variety of total war. They won't let up. They torture. They disappear people, they execute people, they don't just stop with the militants, they go for the families, they go for the general population, they'll imprison children, they'll kill children. This is the nature. This is back to Fanon, right? Like you want to really face the world, realize what it's based on. It's based on raw violence. And so Guevara, wishing to be realistic about the possibility of overcoming this world system, realizes it's going to require a tremendous amount of sacrifice. And he's ready for that. But that also means that, like, at the same time that counterinsurgency technique is a variety of total war, like it doesn't stop with the innocent population. It attacks the whole population. That's what counterinsurgency does. It attacks them with fear. It attacks them with torture. It imprisons any number of them without cause for any period of time. This is what we've been doing in Afghanistan, right? Because this is the nature of counterinsurgency, insurgency itself has to be ready for the same thing. And what Guevara says, that I think goes as far as advocating what looks like terrorism, is he says we have to be ready to attack them, not just on the battlefield, but in their places of recreation, etc. Right? So he's advocating, I think, all forms of asymmetrical warfare because there is no other way to defeat this global parasite, which is ruining the earth. And, you know, this is not his concern, but this is arguably true. You know, diminishing water supplies, making so there's not clean water for the majority of the Earth's population, taking away food for the Earth's population, contributing to global warming, and endlessly concentrating wealth in fewer and fewer people while producing more and more destitute people, the wretched of the earth, to use Fanon and Guevara's language. So this is what he advocates. I'm not sure what are the questions to ask you. I mean, I don't imagine that there are any of you willing to support such an extreme point of view. But I would ask you to understand it, right? Like, I think the point of looking at this kind of stuff is to understand who we are. We, you know? Or maybe to encourage you to want to redefine that we. You know, what is the American military? What is the system of American military presence across the globe? Who is it aligned with? And why? And how does it work? So I guess my question is basically, do you buy this story that I'm telling you? I mean, I'm not advocating what Guevara is advocating either. I really don't. I don't want to be involved in terrorism. I'm not willing to pick up a gun and lay down my life, especially in a situation where I don't think we can win right now. But I wonder if you believe the picture, because I think it's really important to entertain the possibility that this is the world you live in. And that means that like the world you really live in and the world that you're told you live in are radically opposed to one another. Like the idea that like we're the best country in the world, we have the most freedoms, that's why people over in the Middle East hate us, for example. This is all the kind of rap that went on around like September 11th. Why do they hate us so much? Well, they don't hate us because we're free. I don't even know what it means that we're free. The more money I have, the more I can travel. The less I have, the more I'm stuck. Is that freedom? But that's not the problem. The problem is that like American military presence, capitalist enterprises, the dislocations of communities and resources, the lowering of the quality of life that goes along with all this stuff, and then this mass wave of American culture have overridden the bulk of the globe. And this is not welcome. You know, we like to think that we're just like, you know, to deliver Disney to the world is nothing but like a gesture of like, you know, child-friendly mercy. But from the outside, it doesn't look like this at all. From the outside, if you look at Disney, what you see is hyper-racist portrayals of anybody who's not like the Americans, like the capitalists, hyper-racist depictions, etc. So I wonder, I guess the main question is, can you see this contradiction between the ideological picture that we've been given, and we've been given in so many stages, by our families, who meant well, by our schools, who may have meant well, by our media, which operates for profit, but also operates within the parameters set out for it by the Pentagon, for example. You want to understand why that's the case, go read like Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent. You only have to read like the first 5 pages or so, and you'll see, you know, why is it that the mainstream media always liked the Pentagon's line? Because it needs to have a continued open channel with the Pentagon, or else it can't get like footage and shit. Anyway, there's this whole picture that's been built up to us about our justice, about our goodness, about our superiority, about our exceptionalism. There's that story over here, along with the American dream. And then there's the outside perspective, which says, whoa, 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 hold it there, Yankee. Like before you like hop in your tank, before you hop in your reconnaissance airplane and go to destroy some alleged enemies, perhaps you could rethink all this. There's this radically different perspective. So I wonder what you make of this contradiction, whether you agree that contradiction is there, whether you agree that this story is at least persuasive. And if so, what are you going to do about this contradiction?